On June 14th, 1920, the John Robinson Circus pulled into Duluth. They set up the show near the tracks down in West Duluth, but they held a free parade through the streets of downtown. They had a big calliope, painted gold, brass bands, acrobats, jugglers, animals aplenty, all advertising the show that evening. While they were parading, the roustabouts were setting up the tents and getting everything ready for the big show. They were there for just one night. They had plans to be in Virginia, Minnesota the next day. But unfortunately, during the course of that evening, events would transpire that would inalterably change the lives of not only three men, Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGhie, all young men, roustabouts with the circus in their 20s, but also the entire city of Duluth and Minnesota as well. Very little had changed for African Americans between the Civil War and World War I. Jim Crow laws basically kept things essentially static after the Civil War. We replaced slavery with systems of labor that were so oppressive that it made very little difference whether or not they were considered free by law. African Americans could not vote. Poll taxes and even quizzes, tests at polls were given to African Americans specifically to keep them from voting. The people who led the South during the Civil War were given all of the political positions. The few African Americans who had been elected to office were eventually eliminated, and it was all white politicians after that. But by the time World War I rolled around, 1917 is when the U.S. Declared war. Things were beginning to change. In fact, 350,000 African Americans served in segregated units during World War I. There were two African American regiments who saw combat as part of French armies. 171 African Americans were awarded the French Legion of Honor. All of the rest served in support roles. They were kept very separate from white troops. And when they came back, they expected to assume the mantle of full U.S. citizens. Things didn't quite pan out that way. There were labor shortages across the United States. Immigration had all but stopped during the war. The war effort had spurred a lot of industry across the country. And in fact, U.S. Steel was the biggest employer in Duluth. There were about 495 African American people living in Duluth, almost all of them working for U.S. Steel. And unfortunately, U.S. Steel used them to divide and separate. They paid the African American workers a lot less. They wouldn't allow them to live in white communities. They had to live in their own segregated communities. And U.S. Steel essentially used them as a strike-breaking force. Not actively, but de facto. What they would do is tell white workers who were striking was that they could just get a whole bunch more African Americans who worked for half the wages. So there was an awful lot of anger and trouble already simmering in Duluth by the time the circus rolled into town on June 14th. And in fact, nationwide, we had just experienced in 1919 what was called the Red Summer. This was termed the Red Summer because African Americans began fighting back against racial injustices and racial violence across the country. It was a year in which more people died as a result of these types of fights than at almost any other time prior, or at least for many years prior. And just to give you a sense of what the general tenor of the country was feeling from an African American perspective, this is a poem from a man named Claude McGhie, who was a leader in the Harlem Renaissance, which was going on at that time in New York City. It's called If We Must Die. If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. So the racist policy of keeping blacks as cheap labor served U.S. Steel very well, and it led to racist ideas. I recommend a book called Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi. It's an absolutely marvelous book, the premise of which is that racist ideas don't come first. Racist policies come first, and it's clear to me from my research that in Duluth at that time, using black people as cheap labor was beneficial to U.S. Steel. It made them a lot of money, and it also allowed them to keep other wages low. It also fostered a community that was at odds with one another, a community divided, a community that saw black people as a threat. And so by the time the circus came to town on June 14th, the tinder was already in place for the fire that was coming. On June 15th, the police got a call from a white man, a young man, about 18 years old, that he and his girlfriend had been held up the night before by a group of black men at gunpoint, and that his girlfriend had been sexually assaulted. Those were all of the facts that had been presented to the police. The police rounded up Clayton, Jackson, McGhie, and a number of other African-American workers in the circus and held them in the downtown jail at 1st and 2nd. During the course of that day, rumors spread and a mob assembled. The newspaper figured that somewhere around perhaps as many as 9,000 to 10,000 people assembled outside the prison. In a town of 90,000, that represents 10% of the population. Firemen attempted to quell the crowd with hoses, but they were quickly overmatched by the crowd. Police essentially stood idly by while the crowd broke into the jail with whatever they could find: iron bars, rails, wood, clubs. They broke down the doors and they marched Clayton, Jackson, and McGhie outside and prepared to hang them from the lamppost at 1st and 2nd. A preacher, a reverend, climbed up on the lamppost and begged the crowd to let justice take its course. He was quickly shouted down. The crowd lynched Clayton, Jackson, and McGhie one after the other and let them hang there. They took pictures. Later, they made postcards and passed them around. Their bodies were taken away. Eventually, they were buried in unmarked graves in Duluth and forgotten, officially, for many years, until a group of brave people decided that this story had to be faced head on. And now at the corner of 1st and 2nd, you can find a very large and beautiful memorial to racial tolerance, to Clayton, Jackson, and McGhie, and the events that transpired June 14th and 15th. I urge you to go take a look at the newspaper, the Duluth Herald and the Duluth News Tribune. You can find these, I'll provide the links for you. You can read the first-hand accounts. You can read interviews with people celebrating their necktie party that they were going to hold. You can read that there was virtually no evidence given, that a doctor examined the woman and found no evidence of a physical assault. The woman herself never made any accusation. The accusation came from her boyfriend. It's a story as old as racial intolerance, racism, and hatred. This country has been taught to fear black men raping white women. And that's pretty much the synopsis of the story. The song that I wrote as a result of learning these events took me some time. I had to figure out where I fit in. And sadly, in imagining myself as part of that mob, I was forced to consider the fact that there's a pretty good chance that I would have been one of those people. I don't like to think that, and I'd like to prefer to think that I would have fought, but 9 or 10,000 people were there, and only 1 or 2 did fight back. So I decided to write the song from the perspective of someone in the crowd. And I used the theme of the circus as a show to tell the story. I think I'll just play it. You can decide for yourself whether or not I succeeded. Jugglers and acrobats leap through Duluth from the golden Calliope, trailing behind them with shovels and brooms, Clayton, Jackson, McGhie. So step right up and join the throng, thrills and wonders to see. America's favorite show is in town, starring Clayton, Jackson, McGhie. Well, they filled up the big top with gypsies and turds and a snarling menagerie. The knockabout act they held round the back for Clayton, Jackson, McGhie. So step right up and join the throng, thrills and wonders to see. America's favorite show is in town, starring Clayton, Jackson, McGhie. They all look alike, so the cops drag them in. Justice Sweet shouted with glee. A necktie dance at second and first for Clayton, Jackson, McGhie. So step right up and join the throng, thrills and wonders to see. America's favorite show is in town, starring Clayton, Jackson, McGhie. Well, they folded the big top and loaded the car. The train rumbled off through the trees, but the howling and laughter will haunt me hereafter like Clayton, Jackson, McGhie. So step right up and join the throng, thrills and wonders to see. America's favorite show is in town, starring Clayton, Jackson, McGhie. America's favorite show is in town, starring Clayton, Jackson, McGhie.